Before I went to Dayton, I was a rock drummer, and we opened for Steppenwolf, the James Gang, Savoy Brown, hung out with the Allman Brothers, and that was did that for about 10 years. I mean, I had terrible grades in college. I used to tell my students this. Don't worry about grades. Don't tell your parents I said that, but don't worry about grades are not that important. Because I had terrible grades because I was playing rock and roll all through high school and college and never went to class. I was sleeping it off.
Now you have someone in the audience that was in one of your bands?
Randy Gage back here is my first bass player.
All right. Well, I don't know as if we have any time for any sort of impromptu jam session, but I don't know if you brought your instruments maybe afterwards. So you played the drums, right?
I was a drummer.
Yeah.
I had a flaming drum solo that I stole from another guy. He wasn't as good as I was, so I stole it from him. And I would set my sticks on fire, and the lights would go out, and they would wipe this flammable stuff on all my cymbals, right? Well, the key was that my singer, when the lights went off, was supposed to go back, take the sticks out of the flammable stuff, and squeeze them out. Well, we're opening for the James Gang, and he was so wired and so excited he forgot to squeeze them out. So I hold my sticks up in the classic power rock pose like this, and the crowd's going crazy. Yeah. And I just hit one cymbal. Now this is a teaching moment, right? You can do things two ways. You can take something that's really easy and make it look hard, which is what every magician in the world does. They take something that's basically really easy, and then the dancing girls come out in the smoke and all the other stuff, and they go, aha, a dove. They go, oh man, that was... So, or you can take something that's really hard and make it look easy, like Michael Jordan, when he dunks the ball over 5 guys. Right? So I took something really easy and made it look hard. So and I'm going to hit one cymbal. It looked like the Mekong Delta. I mean, napalm everywhere, and they've got the fire extinguishers out and everything, and I'm screaming, Corky, and yeah, man, yeah, So I hit the other cymbal, Mekong Delta on that side of the stage, and I had like 90 tom-toms. So I thought, well, maybe if I play these fast enough, I can pound out the flame. And I'm surrounded. Now I've got hair down to here, scarves. That was when you wore a lot of scarves on your arms and stuff, And any second I was expecting to be the Human Torch, Fortunately, it died out. And the audience is you could tell they were a little let down. Oh, he's not going to die. Oh, well, yeah, that was really good, So it was fun.
That's wow. That's something else. Now you wore earplugs though.
I did
as a drummer.
What'd you say?
Exactly. We have a colleague here. Our chief economist was a drummer.
All right.
He didn't wear earplugs, and you can tell because when he talks, it's always with his outdoor voice.
Well, I had those lead guitar amps, the big Marshall stacks sitting right in my ear every night. Man, if I didn't wear earplugs, I would have been dead.
So you're a native Arizonan.
Yes.
And that's where you got your undergrad degree once you decided that the rock and roll life maybe should be hung up. You decided you went from rock and roll to wanting to be a history professor.
Just like that. In a 6-week summer session, my goal was to get a teaching certificate because I was looking for an easy day gig, right? Teaching is easy, right? So I'm going to get a teaching day gig and play rock and roll at night. And I needed a teaching certificate. And to get the teaching certificate, I needed a history class because, you see, I had a degree from a major U.S. university, Arizona State University, and I never had a U.S. history class when I took that degree. So I went back to school in the summer of '76 and took a history class, changed my life. I had Robert J. Lowenberg, who's the son of the famous Yale historian Bert Lowenberg. He's a Straussian, Vogelinian, I never, von Mises, Hayek. He's quoting all these people in class. Who are these people? And we developed a little cult following. Maybe 10 of us started following him around through all these classes, and we've never heard these ideas before. And I said, I want to be him.
That's amazing. But then you go from the desert and the sun and the fun of the greater Phoenix area, and you end up teaching in Ohio for 31 years?
Preceded by 1 year in Richland Center, Wisconsin, which is 60 miles due west of Madison. It was a teeny tiny little college. It was really almost like a junior college, but that's not what they call them in Wisconsin. 200 students. And it was so small, I kid you not, they made me the assistant men's basketball coach. Okay, I'm going to guard. And I was an NCAA men's basketball coach. We went 5-14.
Well, you won a couple. You won a few. That's
we actually got into the playoffs that year.
Yeah, okay.
And then I got the job in Dayton. And I was telling Chuck just before we started that I had 2 offers, and my other offer was Texas A&M. And I really wanted to come to A&M. Oh man, it was a great gig. They had 4 other business historians, so there'd be a lot of synergy. And as I'm doing the interview, the head of the department gets a phone call from the president. He says, all hiring has to be stopped, immediate freeze, oil revenues fell. And so, okay, Dayton, here I come.
Wow. So tell me about the steps that it took to become a #1 New York Times bestseller. I mean, did you have any inkling that would happen with that effort?
No, in Patriots History, Mike and I started in the late 90s, and we honestly thought we were going to end up selling this book out of a van, along with the old-fashioned light bulbs at work, and plastic bags and straws and, psst, buddy, straws and Patriots History of the United States,
Yeah, you better keep that quiet. We are in Austin, by the way.
Yeah, I know. So we got 2 offers. I can't even remember the other publisher, but one publisher was Sentinel, which was Penguin, was starting a conservative imprint, and ours was the lead book out of the gate. And it did pretty well. We were reviewed by the Wall Street Journal, Claremont Review of Books, all that sort of stuff. And it settled into a nice pattern of royalties and sales for about 6 or 7 years. I went on to write some other books. And then in 2010, I was invited on the Glenn Beck show. Now, Beck now and Beck what he was in 2010 are night and day. Beck had 3.5 million viewers. It's like 300 times what CNN has. It's just outrageously huge. And so I gave him a copy of Patriots History. He says, I know this book. Do I know this book? Well, if you've read Patriots History, the correct response is, this is a great book. So I knew he hadn't read Patriots History. And he, we do the show. He calls me at home 4 days later, Larry, when you're on the show, I hadn't read your book. I go, I know, Glenn. I go, that's okay. He says, no, I always read the guest books, but I read yours over the weekend. Well, it's a 1,000-page book, right? This is a great book. And he starts holding up Patriots History every night, 3, 4, 5 times a night with little yellow post-its. You got to get this. This is the best history book ever written. And this went on for a week. Millions of dollars of free advertising. And I get the call from my publisher, Larry, you're #1 on Amazon now, and you're going to be on the New York Times list this week. I said, well, that's great. I get a call the next week, Larry, you're going to be in the top 10 of the New York Times. I said, well, that's wonderful. Then I get the call, and I can hear over the speakerphone they're partying. I go, woo-hoo, woo! I can hear it going on back there. And they say, you're going to be #1 on the New York Times list this week. I said, well, that's wonderful. That's great. No, you don't get it. You're going to be #1. I said, no, that's great. No, look, you're going to be in Target. You're going to be in Costco. You're going to be in Walmart. I said, wait a minute. We're going to be in Walmart? Thank you, Jesus. Because it meant that we would be reaching the very people. Right. I don't care if a bunch of pointy-headed people over at, UT Austin read this. I want ordinary people.
Be careful with that pointy-headed.
I want ordinary people to read the book. That's what it was like. And so they were shipping 19,000 copies a day. I couldn't believe it. It was just unbelievable.
That's great.
So we are now in our 30th printing.
30th.
With our 4th edition is coming out this summer, all the way through Obama and the first 2 years of Trump.
So before we get to Reagan, let's talk, because I think this would be an interesting transition. You were here a few years ago for Rockin' the Wall.
Right.
And what struck me about the cultural aspect, the little-known cultural aspect to the West, and specifically the United States, essentially winning the long-running Cold War with the Soviet Empire, is the connection with two presidents. Number one, the president that you've written about in your most recent book, and number two, our current president, who kind of came out of that universal recognition through reality television and through his brand products. A lot of Americans today don't realize that while Ronald Reagan was never considered necessarily an A-list actor, in the 1950s, he was the most popular actor in Hollywood, as far as popularity goes. And so it seems to me that the cultural aspect of history and politics is often not properly treated.
Right. Reagan starts with 100% name recognition. I mean, everybody in America knew who Ronald Reagan was when he ran for president. And I was struck by how important this was in the last election in Ohio for Senate when Jim Renacci was running against Sherrod Brown. Renacci spent virtually his entire campaign trying to get name recognition because nobody even knew who he was. So Reagan, and there's a kind of misunderstanding, he's a B actor. That doesn't mean he's not a good actor. What the B actors were, they would have B pictures that would open up for the A picture. And usually the B picture was shot by a totally different unit, totally different director, and they were shorter. They were at most an hour. And the idea was that many B actors would graduate to be A-listers. And Reagan was on his way to doing that with Newt Rockne, All-American, and with King's Row, which he should have gotten an Oscar nomination for that. I think most people agree he should have gotten a nomination for that and didn't. And then the war came along. And Reagan didn't see combat. He was in the film unit, which they call Fort Roach or Fort Wacky, because the guys are so crazy there. And so he didn't see combat, but it really interrupted his film career. When he came out, he just never was the same actor. And I've got to make this point because I don't think other biographers make it. Reagan didn't want to work that hard at acting. He just didn't want to work that hard. He was not the kind of guy like Heath Ledger who would literally kill himself in a role, or Christian Bale. When I've seen movies with Christian Bale and you go, is that Christian Bale? How did he do that to himself? Reagan only did that one time, and that was for King's Row, and it paid off. But, for example, Reagan wouldn't even take parts that cast him as a villain. He just didn't see himself as a villain. And the one time he played a villain in a movie, which was one of his last movies, it was a flop.
Let's, one last side discussion before we get to your book. You wrote a book on the verge of President Trump winning, and you actually had the title for the book and everything predicted before he won.
Yes.
What exactly was that all about? Tell me a bit about that effort.
I had been following numbers in Ohio with a bunch of number crunchers in Ohio, and we saw Ohio as one of the, obviously, key states. And something that one of the guys did, an incredible bit of research, he was able to take the unaffiliated voters in Ohio, who are not independents. In Ohio, if you don't vote in the previous primary or election, you get kicked off into the unaffiliated bin. So in 2012, we badly misjudged that and thought Romney was going to win Ohio because of all these unaffiliated voters were independents, and Romney was leading with independents. Well, no, these were all lazy Democrats who hadn't voted in the primary because Obama had nobody to challenge him in the primary. So this friend of mine went through and looking at 20 years of voting history for an address, he was able to say, this person is a Republican, this is a Democrat, this is a true unaffiliated. And he was able to allocate those out as we started to see the early and absentee votes come in. And it was clear to us by then that Trump wasn't just going to win Ohio, he was going to blow it out of the water in Ohio. I had him predicted to win by 4.5, and he won by 9. But so that caused me to start looking at these same kinds of voter registration statistics in Iowa, North Carolina, Florida, and Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is shocking. The Democrats have seen 250,000 fall off their rolls since 2012. It's really an amazing loss of voters. And so looking at all those stats, I go, you know what? Trump's going to win this with between 300 and 320 electoral votes. So I tweeted that on August 20, 2015, that Trump would win with between 300 and 320 electoral votes. And the final was 306.
Well, we have someone in our audience who works at our think tank who was the first to predict a similar margin. James Quintero over there, he took a lot of grief from his fellow pointy-headed think tankers, but he was right, and most of his colleagues weren't. So, so we haven't been hearing it from him though for 2 years straight. So the Reagan project, how long did this take for you to research, and what were the kind of primary sources of information that you were looking into to help prepare yourself to write this book?
Well, you know, my approach has been to stair-step my level of writing. I didn't just start off going, okay, I'm going to write a biography of a president. I started with a history of American business, which my field is business history. So I'm going to try to write a history of American business. I did that, and it was reasonably successful. And so I said, okay, if I can do a history of American business, I ought to be able to do a history of the United States, if I have some help for my really weak areas. So I brought in Mike Allen, and we wrote Patriots History of the United States. I wrote some other books in the meantime on military history, on 7 events that made America. And in 7 events that made America, 2 of the chapters, the one on rock and roll and the one on Reagan's biggest mistake, which was Lebanon, caused me to do research in the Reagan papers. I go, you know what? I bet I could write a biography. I've never written a biography before. I mean, some business people have paid me to write like vanity biographies. But I think I could do this. And so that was 2009, I began researching this, and I really worked on it off and on ever since then, mostly in the papers. If you're into he said, she said, and you know Nancy said this, and I interviewed Don Regan for this, and I didn't do a lot of interviews. 90% of my work was in the Reagan papers. I looked at stuff nobody else has ever seen in the Reagan papers.
Give us an example or two of some of the things that you looked at that you think have not been explored adequately.
Well, this is Texas, so we could talk energy.
Let's do that.
Reagan and his team came up with a NAFTA version of energy called CAFTA, the Canadian-American Free Trade Agreement. And the idea was to make U.S., Canada, Mexico, but we couldn't get Mexico on board. So it was Canada and America in an energy-free trade zone, always designed with the Soviets in mind. This was to lower our energy prices so the Soviet oil would be less profitable, would give them less hard currency. And so I brought in a former student of mine who just hit a big oil field off of Guinea. I mean, this guy's going to be rich. And they now have Exxon is basically buying them out, and they're on to another one. But he knows energy. And I said, would you do me a favor, and would you just kind of go through some of these papers and see what you find that stands out? And he goes, man, look at this. And he starts showing me all this stuff on CAFTA. Well, nobody else had ever touched that stuff. So that's a pretty big one. Probably, and this is going to disappoint a lot of your Reagan fans. It sure disappointed me. Probably the biggest find I had that was negative. Reagan was not flummoxed or browbeaten or fooled into signing Simpson-Mazzoli. Okay? It wasn't that, oh, gee, those Democrats, boy, they really shafted me on this.
So Simpson-Mazzoli, that was the 1986 amnesty.
Amnesty, $3 million. Ronald Reagan and his team wrote Simpson-Mazzoli in 1981, and they pushed it for 5 years. Simpson-Mazzoli was Ronald Reagan's idea. Amnesty from the get-go was Ronald Reagan's idea. The main issue they were trying to deal with was not Mexicans. They were trying to deal with the Haitians and the Cubans that had been given to him as a legacy from Carter. But part of it was always this thing about amnesty for the 3 million Mexican immigrants. And his team pushed it until they finally got the right legislation in '86, but that was his legislation.
So tell me a bit about the preparation, the intellectual preparation that you discovered with Reagan, because one of the things that is fascinating to me through history is how Reagan's opponents, especially, well, I suppose on both sides of the aisle, would look down upon him as a mere actor and somebody who was an empty suit. What was it Clark Clifford said, that he was an amiable dunce? Right.
Haynes Johnson sleepwalking through history.
Right. And so how is it that reality was just 180 degrees opposite that? Walk the audience through some of the preparation, the intellectual preparation that really began back when Reagan was an FDR Democrat.
Right.
And started to really begin to grapple with some of the issues during the Great Depression.
Well, it starts really when he's at Eureka College, and he's not a great student. He's given an honorary degree at Eureka years later, and he said, "Funny, I always thought my first degree was honorary." but he is interested in economics, and on a kind of side level, his girlfriend's girlfriend's father was a pastor, and he greatly influenced Reagan and his moral intellectual development. And these two things kind of wound together as he starts into Hollywood. His dad was a New Deal Democrat who, during the Great Depression, was running a agency there for the New Deal in terms of trying to get people work. And Jack would see all these people come in, and he was struck by how once they got welfare, they didn't want to work. And even though he remained a Democrat, Jack began to teach Ron about, this is a problem with the welfare program. And it is very interesting. Reagan never, ever dissed FDR. I could not find one single time where Reagan dissed FDR, but he would totally destroy the New Deal programs. He had a way of separating FDR, the man, from his programs, much the way in 88 in Moscow, Reagan's asked, probably by Sam Donaldson, who's always asking him obnoxious questions. "So, do you still believe the Soviet Union, evil empire? Huh? And he said, "No, not anymore. That was a different time, a different place." Because he had met Gorbachev now, and he was separating Gorbachev from the evil empire of communism. So Reagan goes through the New Deal and begins to see some of the damage that's caused. And by the time he's an actor, he is very politically motivated, and he reads everything. And so one of my leading bullet points on this book is that Reagan was an intellectual, as defined by the fact that somebody has an overwhelming interest in ideas. Because from a very early point on, Reagan was arguing and talking ideas, conceiving solutions, and to the point that his fellow actors didn't want to be around him because he was boring. They wanted to talk girls and parts and whatever else, but he wanted to talk politics. So after the war, and after his acting career begins to fade a little bit, he's still president of Screen Actors Guild, which prepared him for the presidency in terms of negotiating with unions. He learned to negotiate with the communists from negotiating with the communist unions. And he learned that aspect, and then in the 50s, he became the spokesman for General Electric through General Electric Theater. And this required him to speak to large audiences of ordinary factory workers. And this is where he developed the famous 3x5 cards. He found that he only needed like 2 or 3 bullet points to talk to them, and he could just kind of riff after that, and they would ask him questions. And he has some great anecdotes from those times. He said one time he was speaking to a group of women, and this is his words, "A real bull of a woman came up and backed me into a corner and said, Sonny, I'd like to back you into a corner." And he said, "Ma'am, it'd have to be a pretty big corner." So he learned another aspect, how to consolidate political ideas and big picture ideas into 3 or 4 bullet points that ordinary people could understand. And then, of course, he goes on to be governor of California, where he learns to negotiate with Democrats on something they both want, which is a balanced budget, because they had to have it in California. And after that, he kind of topped it all off by these radio addresses. And what I found, people would say, well, Reagan had other people write these. He wrote everything in his own hand. There's no question he wrote it. And then you look at the sources. And he would have 10 or 12 good, so as a historian, I can tell you these are good sources, primary sources for an address on energy or something, and maybe a 5-minute address, and he had 10 very deep sources that he had researched himself. So Reagan prepared himself for the presidency at every single level of his life.
So that on the intellectual level, but you can't merely be intellectual and assume the mantle of leadership. So go back to the beginning. You had mentioned that his girlfriend at Eureka, her dad was a pastor.
Yes.
Now, one of the first things that he did in Eureka College that kind of showed leadership would seem perhaps to maybe not have pleased that girlfriend's dad. What did Reagan do in Eureka that maybe showed that he had the beginnings of a leader?
Well, there was an event called the Grind, which was a dance, which is odd because Eureka prohibited dancing. But they did allow this where the boys would get in one circle, the girls would get in an inner circle. They would dance kind of in opposite directions as the music played, and then you would stop when they would stop the music, and you were to talk to that person and get to know that person in front of you. And it was a way to get all the students to know the other students. Well, the administration, for various reasons, banned the Grind. And they did this just before the Thanksgiving week break. They had a week of Thanksgiving break at that time. And one of the seniors called a meeting. They went out and they rang the bell, and hundreds of students came running out, and he says, look, we can't allow this to stand. We have to stop this. And we're going to have a strike. And we need somebody to lead this strike. And it can't be me because some of the classes were being canceled by the administration. The seniors were afraid it would look like if the seniors led the strike, it was out of self-interest. They said, we need a freshman. And they all look at Reagan because he had acting skills, and people had heard him speak, and he was a great speaker even then. So he agreed to lead this strike. Well, the first thing they do is they go on break. So they've got to hope that when they come back from break, they can get a strike going, that emotions are still up, right? They come back, and all but 6 students agreed to strike, and 2 of those were the president's daughters. And so Reagan successfully leads the first student protest of any president in history. No, not even Barack Obama led a student protest, but Reagan did.
That's amazing. And so from there, of course, you had the effort by the Soviet Union and their allies to penetrate into key American institutions. They knew that America was different, built of different timber than much of Western Europe, in that we had a deeper faith, we had a stronger nationalism perhaps, but that they could weaken us by going in through both higher education and in through Hollywood. Tell us a little bit about Hollywood and his collaboration with Olivia de Havilland, who I think is still around in her 90s, isn't she? Or did she recently pass? I think she's still around.
I think she's still around. Yeah. Reagan is nominated to the Screen Actors Guild, or SAG board, and then soon he becomes, along with William Holden, one of the leading spokesmen on that board. And they realize they are up against a very serious communist infestation. For example, they would try to have resolutions where the resolution would simply say, we support American capitalism. And they couldn't get a majority of the board to sign on to that.
Kind of like the Democrat caucus in Congress right now.
Sort of like that. I mean, it was very serious stuff, and Reagan realized early on he had a problem. He walked into one meeting after he had been nominated to the board, and all of the people on that side of the room got up and walked over to the other side of the room and sat down. He was sitting there by himself, and they let it be known that we're not going to put up with you, buddy. What's interesting about Reagan is that he's a member of a group called HICASP, and don't ask me offhand what that is, Hollywood something or other, but it was a kind of political action group in Hollywood. He's a member of SAG, and very briefly he was a member of a third group, and I can't remember the name of this, and it dies out right after that, within months after Reagan had joined. But what makes it interesting is that Reagan at one time was a member of all 3 of the most prominent political action groups in Hollywood. And so the patriotic guys want to get the communists out of the unions, and so they go meet at Olivia de Havilland's house afterwards, and James Roosevelt was there. He's another one who was there. And they're telling him, what are we going to do about this? And Olivia Havilland's just sitting there looking at him the whole time. He says, why are you looking at me like that? And she said, well, up till now I thought you were a communist. And he said, funny, I thought the same thing about you. So they finally get together, and it's not the rank and file. It's just the leadership who were heavily infested by communists. And when they put resolutions out to the main body, they're overwhelmingly, adopt Reagan's position. So he learns how to deal with them, and as part of the HUAC hearings, he's called to D.C. to testify. And the HUAC committee is just, they're waiting for Reagan to just trash all of Hollywood. And he says, we've identified a number of communists, we think, and I think we've gotten rid of most of them. And he said, I would not want to see any speech code. I would not want to see any limitation on the freedom of speech in this country. He quotes Jefferson to the Congress. It was an amazing, amazing moment where he stands up for Hollywood, yet he stands up for, we don't want communists in.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think Hollywood gives him much credit for that these days.
None.
Yeah. So take us to the latter stages of the preparation for the presidency. So after Nixon, having been one of the youngest vice presidents, or the youngest vice president from, 1952 with the election to 1960, he loses the very close election to JFK, runs for governor in 1962 of California, loses. Reagan supported him then, right? And he was still a Democrat, right? Because as I recall, Reagan asked Nixon, is it better for you if I'm a Democrat or a Republican? Yeah. And he suggested he stay a Democrat to support Nixon, and Nixon's losing 1962
I'm pretty sure it's in that campaign that Reagan is doing an event, Democrats for Nixon or something like that. And a woman comes up and says, all of your positions are Republican positions. Why don't you just become a Republican? He says, well, I will next time I'm able to register. And she says, I'm a registrar. I can register you right now. So he said, okay. And he changed his registration over to Republican that day.
So then in 66 is when he runs for governor of California, right? And then wins 2 terms.
Right.
From 66, it gets reelected in 70, and then goes until 1974, right? And then replaced by Jerry Brown, who just left his second round of the governorship last year. So, or actually, I guess in January of this year. So Reagan officially ran twice for president. Or do you think he some people may have thought he ran a third time earlier, but
well, he runs in 68, and he's really kind of hoping to be drafted. But eventually, I'm running, and he gets the California vote, the delegation, which was huge, but he just wasn't quite ready. Everybody knew he wasn't quite ready then. But interestingly, in 68, people are already saying he's too old. He's already getting people in 68. This guy's he's just too old to run for president. So he makes another run in 76. And that one, of course, was incredibly close. And basically, the Southern delegates cost Reagan the nomination. And after he gives a speech for Ford at the convention, one of the Southern bosses turns to the other boss and goes, "We nominated the wrong guy." So they knew, right? But then again, 76, there's more. Reagan is too old to run, and his family absolutely did not want him to run in 76. He had a meeting with the family, and every single one of them said, "Don't run, don't run." So he gives it one more try in 80, and by then Maureen Reagan was supporting the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, and Reagan's team comes up and they go, "Maureen, what can we do to get you not to be really vocal about the ERA?" And she said, "Tell Dad, his first Supreme Court nominee, I want it to be a woman." So Reagan said, "Deal." Okay, so they get to the convention and Maureen's there and she has buttons that say ERA. And Reagan's team is freaking out, and then they get a closer look at the button and it says elect Reagan anyway.
Tell me about the kind of the financial or the tax cut, the supply side education of Reagan, because Reagan certainly wasn't a supply sider when he was governor of California. In fact, as my former colleagues in the California legislature used to remind me constantly, whenever they could, that he had at the time passed one of the biggest tax increases in state history.
Yep.
Of course, states have to balance their budgets.
Right.
But How is it that Reagan, you've already mentioned how intellectually curious he was. How did he run across people like Jude Wanniski and Art Laffer? How did that happen?
Well, he liked to say that he was not swayed or the light didn't just go on with Laffer and those guys, that he had been reading these guys for years because he was an economics major, such as it was, at Eureka, and he had been studying supply side angles of Mellon and the Mellon tax cuts when he was in school. But the supply side angle after Laffer comes out with it, of course, it's always, you heard the story that Laffer drew the curve on a cocktail napkin, and I used to say, yeah, so what? The Beatles wrote yesterday on a tablecloth, big deal. It's not where you write it, it's what's on the napkin. So he becomes a true believer that the only way that you're going to revive America is with these big supply-side tax cuts that encourage businesses to invest. They aren't Keynesian, which is giving money to people to spend. And there's a big difference, because when you invest, you put up a lot of money up front and you build factories and you hire people, and then they have money to spend. And he thought that was eminently sensible, and he had seen it work in the 20s, and he was now reminded of that 20s growth more than ever. I mean, if you look at the 20s, we had unemployment in the low 2s in the 1920s, utterly astounding levels of unemployment. So Reagan became, I would say he matured into the supply side rather than had it like be an epiphany for him.
So if you think of the three big things that Reagan ran on and what he was hoping to accomplish, you say that he did well in two and failed in the third, because the third was necessary to be sacrificed to get the other two. First of all, give the audience an idea of what those three big things were, and then let's talk about the actual preparation in terms of position papers and personnel and the whole transition effort. So what were the three big things?
Well, win the Cold War.
That's a big one.
Revive the American economy, cut government. And he failed utterly at cutting government, because as he learned, you only have so much political capital, so many arms you can twist, and if you're going to get votes on this, you may not be able to get the votes over here on this. And so he sacrificed cutting government to winning the Cold War and to reviving the economy. And one memo I found just very telling was a memo that had gone out to one of the department heads, doesn't matter which, is commerce, I think, but saying, we want to try to achieve a 10% cut across the board, And the memo came back, gee, I am really down with this, but you know what, I've spent this much money, I've allocated this much money, we really need to spend this much, and so the whole amount that I'm really able to cut is nothing. And he would get this from everybody, even his closest allies who had supported him on cutting government. So he satisfied himself with the first two, which I think are pretty darn good.
It's pretty historic to win a international competition against a nuclear-armed foe and not have formal war declared.
Well, and Reagan approached it. The first thing you have to understand about Reagan is he's the only American president who comes in and says, we're going to win. All the others said, we're going to maintain the status quo. Reagan said, we're going to win the Cold War. And many of his advisors, you can't do that. That's nonsense talk. That's crazy talk. He says, no, we're going to win. And he's asked by a reporter, what's your view of the Cold War? He says, easy, we win, they lose. The reporter said, how can you talk like that? That's crazy. Reagan had an all-encompassing, holistic approach to the Cold War. It involved energy, it involved morality, religion, it involved culture, rock and roll, it involved the military, it involved the reviving of the American economy, which to him was a key aspect of defeating the Soviets, because if we knock interest rates down, okay folks, the Soviets had two things, well, they actually export four things pretty well: vodka, gold, oil, and spies. And so he aimed to take out the oil and the gold. Well, one of his first meetings, literally first month he's in office, with the Saudi oil minister. Says, well, what are you going to do to knock down the price of oil? And he said, well, what will you give us? He said, we'll give you AWACS. We'll give you the Airborne Warning and Control System aircraft. He goes, okay, we'll cut prices and increase production. Okay, so right there, the first prop of the Soviets' export leg was being kicked out from under them. Gold goes to tall Paul Volcker. I'm going to keep you on. What are you going to do? He says, I'm going to get rid of inflation. Volcker squeezes inflation out until in one quarter in 1982 it was zero. Zero inflation, folks. You remember, we used to have 8-9% inflation. We had home mortgage rates in the mid-teens, credit card interest rates high 20s, and they get it down to zero. Well, that just destroys Soviet gold prices because the price of a gold ingot fell tenfold in Reagan's first couple of years. So now they have nothing to sell. He hits them on the moral front. He allies with Pope John Paul. And they begin just hammering the Soviets as the evil empire. These guys are evil. They're godless communists. That was the phrase back then. They are the godless communists. He hits them on the moral front. People come to him, they want to cut Radio Free Europe and Voice of America. And people make an argument to him, no, we actually ought to begin expanding that because we're going to pump rock and roll into the Soviet. Rock and roll? You mean like Wayne Newton? He said, no, like the Beach Boys. Oh, okay, I like the Beach Boys. So we're pumping rock and roll in, and that's totally eroding the Soviet Union. So he had this holistic thing. It's not like I'm just going to build up the military. We're going to defeat them by hitting every single aspect of godless communism.
Tell me about the period of time leading into the first few months of the administration in 1981. What sort of preparation went into that transition, and what was the impression that Reagan left with key members of Congress?
Well, interestingly, Reagan has Meese head his transition team. And everybody talked about Meese as being one of the most disorganized people you could ever find. The line was he couldn't organize a 2-car funeral. And yet he does an incredible job with the transition. So you have the Heritage Foundation, which pumps out all of these policy papers on every single thing from MX missile to oil to SDI. I mean, everything has a position paper, and they start assigning those position papers to these transition teams. And it is the most model transition anyone has ever had. Harvard Business School writes up his transition in a case study of how you do transitions. So their goal was to have 300 of his appointees confirmed by the end of February and have all 600 of the key appointees confirmed by mid-March. Okay, you're looking here at Congress now with Trump, and it's 2 years in, and they still haven't confirmed a lot of his appointees. So not only did he have the people to hit the ground running, but they had their first budget up and ready to go, and they had done profiles of all of the key senators and key House guys that they needed to strong-arm, lobby, coerce, encourage, and they would have like psychological profiles. So you really got to stroke this guy's ego because he thinks he's really hot stuff, and you need to play up to that. This guy is a patriot. All you got to do is play up to the patriotism angle, and he'll go along with you. So when they hit it, they're able to get the economic policy in place very early on, and that, of course, is key.
What role did the failed assassination attempt in March of 1981 play in the huge Reagan tax cut?
The assassination attempt and Reagan's survival insulated him for about 6 to 8 months. He had incredibly high public approval ratings. I write that it wasn't just that he survived the assassination, but the nation survived the assassination. And people saw it that way. And of course, he was nothing but, to the outside, a pillar of stability. He insists on walking into the hospital. Then once he's out of camera range, he collapses, and they have to pick him up. And the doctors didn't even know they had the president there for a while. And they're prepping him and so forth. And they said, what's the patient's address? And 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. They all start looking at each other, and they realize that's what those guys in the black suits there were standing there for. You know, the Secret Service men had to be garbed up too. So the Secret Service men, they're putting on all these scrubs to come in so they can go in with the guys. And Reagan is cracking jokes the whole way through, you know, even when they intubate him and he can't talk, he's writing on a pad, all in all, I'd rather be in Philadelphia, you know. Can I do a reshoot of that last scene? Things like that, you know. And so when he comes out, he's weak for a number of months. And there's a good argument that Lou Cannon makes, I think I agree with this, that Stockman kind of pulled the wool over his eyes in a briefing in which Stockman was going to do some Social Security cuts, COLA cuts. And Reagan didn't quite pick up on it, I think largely because he was still a little bit weakened from the assassination. But other than that, it gave him time the same way the Falklands War gave Margaret Thatcher the time she needed for her programs to work. These don't happen immediately. You've got to have a little bit of cushion there to get the programs working.
Well, that's a great summary. Before we go to questions, is there any one big thing? You mentioned, of course, the amnesty is the big disappointment. What's one big surprise that you found, perhaps other than that, when you were doing your research on this book? And then we'll go to questions from the audience.
It wasn't so much a surprise as it was a confirmation. I never believed, as Cannon did, that Reagan's advisors were the ones kind of leading him around, that he only adopted whatever position he had because it was the last person in his ear. It's very clear, for example, with SDI. Early on, he had this vision, long before anybody else previously thought of it. He's talking about doing something about nuclear missiles in the late 60s. How can we stop these things? And so he's the one leading his advisors. He's the one laying out the agenda. And when you look at the NSDD, National Security Decision documents, you look at the discussions within those and read the minutes, Reagan is absolutely leading that, and the other people are asking and answering questions related to what Reagan was directing and what direction he was taking them in.
That's always so fascinating to me because, again, the revisionist history continues to claim that that wasn't the case at all,
right?
Per Lou Cannon's biography
right.
of Reagan. Well, now we're at the time when we'd like to take some questions from the audience. We probably, yes, we do have a microphone. So what I'd like to do is let's agree that your question will be a question and not a statement, number one. And number two, just let us know who you are and then ask your question and use the microphone because we are streaming this and there are people watching us online. So it's important that they get to hear this as well. So do we have any questions? Right here in the middle.
Thank you. Hi, my name is John Saperi. I'm an attorney here in town at Foley & Lardner Law Firm, and I've been around TPPF and the capital scene for a while. My question, Professor, is, and I'm not making a statement, but I'm going to preface the question with a little setup for you. Reagan left office a very popular president among the public, but he wasn't regarded all that well among historians and political scientists at the time. Right. He started creeping up over the years, right, approaching the top 10. And I think the last two I've seen, the C-SPAN survey of presidential historians in 2017 had him at 9. The American Political Scientist survey last year had him at 9. Where do you see, do you think that's going to hold up? Where do you see, I personally think he belongs a couple spots higher on that top 10 list, but where do you see
3. For me, he's right behind Washington and Lincoln and Reagan. Calvin Coolidge is 4.
Nice.
But obviously part of that is due to the passage of time. A lot of the partisans who hated Reagan at the time kind of died out, and people are having to evaluate him in light of his incredible, obvious success in winning the Cold War, you know. I'm not sure on the list of historians he'll get too much higher than that because you know my profession. But I think he's clearly in the top 3.
Very good. Very good. Anything else? Yes, over here. Gives you enough time to think of your next question, people.
Hi, I'm Summer Wise.
Oh, we just lost you.
Okay. I'm Summer Wise. I'm State Republican Executive Committee woman for Senate District 24.
Okay.
When I'm out talking with Republicans, I often hear folks say that they no longer really want our party to be a big tent. And of course, this was one of the key ideals of Reagan and one of the things that he brought to the Republican Party. And so I'm curious about your thoughts about where we go forward from here, and if our Republican Party is changing. Are we still a big tent party?
I think we're a huge tent party. I think we're the only tent party. And you look, for example, at Trump, Hispanic approval now for Trump is in the mid-30s. It's steadily drifted upward. I think probably by 2020 he'll be at low 40s. Black, I have a friend who tracks black approval of Trump. He's moved between 16 and 25% pretty constantly, which is huge. Democrats cannot win a national election without 90% black support. They just can't. In 2016, one of the things that caused Trump to win was that black vote was off in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Florida, and North Carolina by 3%. Now, 3% in Florida is 115,000 votes. That's a lot. I have said all along that I thought Trump would move from blacks not voting for the Democrat, which they did in 2016, to voting for Trump but not other Republicans, because it doesn't wear off on other Republicans yet, it's just Trump, to, by the third cycle, many of those 3-4% will start to vote for all Republicans. 5 or 6% would be more supportive of Trump. So I see no problems with the tent size, quite the contrary. I think we're about the only tent here that has any ideological diversity at all.
Yeah, I think the key there is the diversity, especially given the direction the other side has gone, which is to become more monolithic.
Yes, dangerously so.
Yeah, fascinating. Yes, in the back.
Hi there, my name is Connor Mile. I'm a law clerk for the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And I have a question specifically regarding...
You're going to be hearing that border challenge pretty soon.
Oh, I don't know if that's my judge's particular panel, but maybe so. Reagan racked up two pretty decent electoral victories in 80 and 84. 84 was by an astounding margin.
Right.
Do you think that sort of electoral victory is still possible? What led to Reagan's extremely large margins of victory? He had to draw from both sides of the aisle to do this. Do you think that's still possible? How was Reagan able to get the size of the electoral victories that he did?
Well, honestly, I think the nation has just changed a lot since Reagan's time. I think illegal immigration has basically turned California blue for a very, very long time. I can't imagine any Republican in the near future winning California or New York. Now, that said, I currently have Trump at between 320 and 340 electoral votes for 2020. I think he'll pick up Minnesota. He lost Minnesota by 40,000. Pollster Richard Barris, a friend of mine, said that almost all of that was due to the Access Hollywood tape, and he could track it in the early voting. And we saw this in New Hampshire, for example. We saw it in Ohio. In fact, in Ohio, here's what we saw. That we would get ballots from Republican districts, and we could later go back and look at them. And it would be Trump, down ticket Republican. Trump, down ticket Republican. Access Hollywood tape. Gary Johnson, down ticket Republican. Gary Johnson, down ticket Trump. In other words, it dipped for about a week to where Republicans are putting Johnson at the top, but still voting Republican all the rest of the way down. So I think that Minnesota is very much in play. I think New Hampshire is very much in play. I think all of Maine is very much in play. The voter registration statistics are still on our side. They're still working the right way, but California is gone, and New York is gone. I think probably for the near future, New Jersey and Connecticut are gone too.
Was there someone else back there that I saw that was beginning? Okay, down here on the front.
Yes, you mentioned immigration, of course, and actually, if you listen to Reagan's announcement for president in November of '79, it's like a 20-minute speech that the Ronald Reagan Library has on its website.
Right.
He actually sounds like he's coming out in favor of NAFTA and also in favor of more immigration.
Yep.
Couldn't you make the argument that he actually was more pro-immigration than Jimmy Carter was in the 1980 election? In fact, all the unions at the time hated illegal or any kind of immigration because they thought that obviously it competed with American jobs. So
that's a very interesting point, because one of the things I did find was that after Reagan pushes his plan to become Simpson-Mazzoli, you wouldn't believe it. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the main press lambasted Reagan for not enforcing immigration laws and not enforcing them tightly enough. You know, this will never work. You need to enforce these laws. I thought, whoa, where are you guys today? So I think you're probably right about that. But people, again, I think at the time didn't see it as quite the threat that it is seen as today. By the way, because we kind of glossed over this, but a couple of funny stories with Reagan when he was governor. And one of his big issues was student protests and the massive violent student protests. And you know, I went to school at Cal Santa Barbara, so I see the marks right there where the blood was spilled, you know, I mean, those kinds of things. And he was scheduled to be out of town, and a group of students staged a big protest. And when Reagan heard that they were staging the protest, he canceled his trip and came back in. And they were all standing there in dead silent protest. And he walks between these big lines of students all standing there like this. And he gets to the top of the stairs, he goes, shh. And it cracked them all up. So another time, he's in Santa Barbara looking at the damage, and he's in the limo, and he said a bearded guy comes up, and he's yelling into the window, "We are the future!" And Reagan grabs a legal pad and says, "I'll sell my bonds."
That's good. Have any questions on this side? Going once. Yes.
James Quintero, Texas Public Policy Foundation. Thomas Sowell is on the front page of Drudge Report today, making the point that he's not optimistic when it comes to America's embrace of socialism. And I just wonder if there are lessons that can be learned from Reagan and how he engaged with the public and did such a great job in combating communism. Are there things that those of us on the front lines can also help mimic to help stem the tide of socialism?
Reagan had a great way, of course, of putting things in a very everyday common perspective that people could understand. He didn't speak in Carter-esque high-tech policy language. But Sowell has a point in this regard. Reagan was speaking even then to a much higher educated electorate, that even the kids back then understood some of these basic concepts. And they say they like socialism, they have no clue what socialism is. And I would make a big point in my history classes of spending time showing how socialism and communism are exactly the same thing because they believe in the labor theory of value. What's the labor theory of value? Okay, now we're talking. Because until you get down to the labor theory of value, you don't have any idea what the basic of socialism is, you know? And that's why fascism is the same as socialism, because Hitler believed in the labor theory of value. So there's only two theories of value, the market theory or the labor theory. Sadly today, the level of education is terrible. And I saw this in my own students in the 2000s, how their level of understanding stuff had just dropped horribly. Getting students to read is near impossible. I mean, you almost have to put them in a dungeon and hold the book up in front of them, which is one of the reasons I've started a site called the wildworldofhistory.com. I hope you all go there, wildworldofhistory.com. And our goal is to eventually get short video clips a la Prager University to get out to younger people, which they will look at, but Prager has no follow-up. And so if you look at my thing on Prager University about America's socialist origins, you go, wow, that was really cool. And the next thing you go to is green energy, or something on green energy, or something on unions. And there's no follow-up. And so what I've designed is a website where I teach Patriots History of the United States in a video format, and in which we have heavy follow-up on the ideas and get into these deep ideas of labor theory of value, things like that. So let's hope that it's a matter of students not being educated enough to know the difference, and not that they really do like socialism.
So is it the wild or the wide world?
The wild.
You were a drummer.
I know.
So this is the wild
it's the
world
wild world
of
yes.
history.
History has a wild side, as we like to say.
Wildworldofhistory.com.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It went live last night.
Last night?
Yeah.
Really? Okay.
Been at it for 2 years.
Do we have a question here in the middle? I thought I saw a hand that came up. No, we have another one over here then. Oh, we'll get back to you. You'll be the last question, depending on how long this one takes to ask and answer.
I'm going to go extra long. Yeah, because I do want to first. I'm Patrick McGinnis. Here in Austin. I guess a conservative since the Reagan era. He helped form a lot of our mindset because of his success, of course, following Carter. My first thing is just to mention that Patriot's Guide is an excellent book. Glenn Beck is right, and what you're doing is great. I give it to my kids, or I've given them, tell them read this so that they don't get too polluted by the other stuff they get in their high school history. And so what you're doing with the videos is also great, because my son, Peter, he's getting his history from these little YouTube things, and that's how they learn. They watch these 10-minute things. So,
right.
So that's all great stuff. My question, there's a couple things I want to go to on Reagan and who he picked. I was told, you probably have observed, the Trump administration seems to have a more conservative cabinet than Reagan did. And I wanted to have you speak about that, and also about why he picked George Bush and not Laxalt as his vice president. Can you speak about his appointments and kind of his hits and misses there, and what he was thinking when he did those?
I think the easy answer to the first question, why would, for example, Trump's cabinet be even more conservative than Reagan's, is Reagan was a party guy. He was a member of the Republican Party. Yes, he was somewhat viewed as kind of on the far side here, but he was still a Republican. And so when he goes to fill his cabinet slots, the Republican Party, for the most part, is behind him. Give me a list of people for energy, give me a list of people for defense, give me this, that, and the other. And so he got a lot of help from the establishment when he staffed these positions. My take on Bush is Bush was a fabulous vice president. I am not a George H.W. Bush fan, but man, you couldn't find a better vice president. For 8 years, he was the only one I could find who always stood behind Reagan. Whatever Reagan's position was, that was Bush's position. And even in the debates inside the administration, he was constantly standing up for Reagan when others would, now maybe that's not a good idea, and Bush would be behind him. So, people would say this of McCain and Lindsey Graham, what did McCain have on Graham? I don't know, but Reagan must have had something on Bush, because he was behind him 100%. He was a great Veep.
Last question.
My name is Gary Teal. I'm so old that I remember all of these things that happened. I was a Republican in '78 when I got to college, and I like to think I helped Bill Clements get elected. And then in 1980, all of this started happening, and I'm curious. Obviously, Republican Ronald Reagan didn't have any choice but to work with Democrats in Congress, because they didn't have a majority; they had an overwhelming majority. And one of the things I did in '78 was to campaign really hard against a horrible Democrat running for Congress named Phil Gramm, and I lost that race. So, was there anything in the records and memos that sheds any light on how Reagan managed to find the Southern Democrats, Texas Democrats, Kent Hans, and others?
You've got to remember, Democrats back then were different than the Democratic Party that's out there today is just, it's radical. It is totally radicalized. And you know, Biden, you may have seen this interview the other night with the focus group, and none of them wanted Biden because he wasn't radical enough. And Biden's probably the only guy I think that could give Trump a run for his money, but he'll never get it, you know. So it wasn't hard to identify those guys because they really did have America's best interest at heart. They really did want the economy to improve. You know, all you had to do was approach them. That's not the case today. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find 10 Democrats in Congress who really want the country to do better under Trump. It's a much different era.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Professor. I think this has been an enlightening time here to learn about what is now becoming ever-receding history and is subject to being revised and changed and really shaped perhaps more for ideological reasons than for historical or truthful reasons. And it's always a joy to hear someone who's delved into the research and kind of reinforced and rediscovered a lot of things that had happened back in the 30s all the way up until his presidency in the 1980s. It really shaped a very key period of time in American history. Appreciate your coming out to Austin, Texas and joining us here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. When does your book come out and how can people get it?
It comes out May 1st. There's flyers out there. We have flyers available that have the website for obviously Amazon, Barnes & Noble. I am told by my publisher, and real quickly, the history of this book, I'd been working on it for many, many years, and my agent says, I have something that's come up. Milo Yiannopoulos is starting a publishing arm, and he wants to get a really big name on board with a big project. So long and short of it is, I was to be published, I was to be the third book out of Milo's publishing house. You know what happened to Milo, So I was left without a publisher, but with a completed and fully edited book. They had done all the work. And so we shopped it around, and Post Hill made us a great offer. So it's coming out from Post Hill, who did the graphic novel Clinton Cash. So I am told by Post Hill that it is better for the book sales if you buy it from Barnes & Noble online than from Amazon. Because I am told that Barnes & Noble drives Amazon orders, not vice versa. So I'd appreciate it if you pre-order a copy of the book. And, you know, there's got to be a way, if you get one of my business cards or you get a hold of me on Wild World of History, if you order it, ship it to me. When it arrives, I'll give you my address. I'll sign it and ship it back to you at no extra cost.
There you go.
You get an autographed copy.
Well, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending another great event at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Good afternoon.
Thanks, Scott. Great interview. Thank you.